The winter of 1917 descended upon Petrograd like a shroud. The sky bruised purple and gray, the Neva River beginning its slow surrender to ice. In the streets, the cobblestones were slick with freezing rain, and the air carried the smell of coal smoke and unwashed bodies, of a city holding its breath. The Great War had bled Russia white. Millions of men had died in muddy trenches along the Eastern Front, their bodies swallowed by the earth, their names forgotten by a government that had sent them to die for a cause they barely understood. In the cities, bread lines stretched for blocks, women standing for hours in the cold, their shawls pulled tight, their faces hollow with hunger. Children cried from empty bellies, the elderly collapsed in the snow and sometimes did not rise again. The Tsar, Nicholas II, had abdicated his throne in March, and in his place a provisional government had risen, fragile and uncertain, led by men who spoke of democracy but could not feed the people or end the war. The provisional government was led by Alexander Kerensky, a lawyer and moderate socialist who believed in gradual reform, in working within the structures of parliamentary democracy. He was an eloquent speaker, passionate in his defense of freedom and justice, but he was also a man caught between worlds, between the old Russia of hierarchy and privilege and the new Russia that was demanding to be born. The soldiers at the front were deserting in droves, walking away from the trenches, heading home to their villages to claim the land they had been promised. The peasants were seizing estates without waiting for legal authorization, dividing up the fields, burning the manor houses, settling old scores against the landlords who had exploited them for generations. In the cities, workers were organizing into Soviets, councils that met in factories and meeting halls, debating, arguing, trying to find a way forward through the chaos.
Into this maelstrom stepped Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, a man whose very name would come to embody revolution. He had spent years in exile, wandering through Europe, writing, plotting, refining his vision of a world remade. Born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov in 1870, he had taken the name Lenin as a revolutionary pseudonym, one of many he used to evade the Tsarist police. His older brother had been executed for plotting to assassinate the Tsar, and that event had shaped Lenin's life, had turned him into a professional revolutionary, a man who lived for one purpose only: the overthrow of the existing order and its replacement with a dictatorship of the proletariat. He was not a tall man, not physically imposing, with a balding head and a reddish beard. But there was something in his eyes, a cold certainty, an absolute conviction that history was on his side, that the laws of historical materialism that Marx had discovered meant that capitalism would inevitably fall and socialism would inevitably rise. When he returned to Russia in April 1917, arriving at Finland Station in a sealed train provided by the German government, desperate to knock Russia out of the war and relieve pressure on the Western Front, he stepped onto the platform and addressed the crowd with words that cut through the uncertainty like a blade. The other Bolsheviks expected him to support the provisional government, to work with the other socialist parties, to take things slowly. Instead, Lenin declared that there could be no cooperation with the bourgeois government, that the Bolsheviks must work toward a second revolution, that all power must go to the Soviets. Long live the socialist revolution, he said, and the workers and soldiers who had gathered there felt something shift, felt the ground beneath them tremble with possibility. The Bolsheviks were not the largest party in Russia, not the most popular. That distinction belonged to the socialist revolutionaries, the party of the peasants, with their long history of resistance to Tsarism. The Mensheviks, the moderate socialists who believed in gradual change and working-class consciousness, also commanded significant support. But the Bolsheviks were the most disciplined, the most ruthless, the most willing to seize the moment when others hesitated. Lenin understood something that his rivals did not, that in times of chaos, hesitation is death, and that power belongs to those who are willing to take it. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1917, the provisional government stumbled from crisis to crisis, unable to end the war, unable to redistribute land to the peasants, unable to provide bread to the starving cities. In July, the Bolsheviks attempted an uprising in Petrograd, but it was premature, poorly organized, and it failed. Lenin was forced to flee to Finland, hiding in a worker's hut, shaving his beard and wearing a wig to avoid recognition.
But the failure was temporary. In September, General Lavra-Kornilov, the commander of the Russian army, attempted a coup against the provisional government, marching troops toward Petrograd in an effort to establish a military dictatorship. Kerensky, desperate, turned to the Bolsheviks for help. They organized workers' militias, armed the Red Guards, and when Kornilov's soldiers reached the outskirts of the city, Bolshevik agitators met them, talked to them, convinced them not to fight. The coup collapsed without a shot being fired, but the Bolsheviks now had weapons, organization, and momentum. The provisional government had been exposed as weak and indecisive, dependent on the very forces it feared. And with each failure, the Bolsheviks grew stronger, their message simple and seductive: peace, land, bread. 3 words that spoke to the deepest needs of a desperate people. On the night of October 25, 1917, by the old Russian calendar, November 7th by the modern Gregorian calendar, the Bolsheviks made their move. The Winter Palace, that great monument to imperial grandeur, stood pale and ghostly in the autumn darkness, its windows glowing with lamplight, its baroque facades and ornate decorations a reminder of an age that was dying. Inside, the ministers of the provisional government huddled together in the malachite room, uncertain, afraid, knowing that something was coming but unable to stop it. Outside, in the streets and along the bridges, Bolshevik forces moved into position, not in the thousands, but in the hundreds, armed workers and sympathetic soldiers moving quietly through the city. The battleship Aurora sat anchored in the Neva, its guns trained on the palace, a symbol of naval power that had thrown its lot in with the revolution. The Bolsheviks had been planning this for weeks. Leon Trotsky, the chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, had organized the Military Revolutionary Committee, ostensibly to defend the city against German attack, but in reality a cover for preparing an insurrection. Trotsky was a brilliant orator and organizer, a man who had joined the Bolsheviks only recently, but who had quickly become Lenin's most trusted lieutenant. He coordinated the seizure of key points throughout the city: the telephone exchange, the telegraph office, the railway stations, the bridges. By dawn, on the 26th, the Bolsheviks controlled almost all of Petrograd, and the provisional government was isolated in the Winter Palace, protected only by a women's battalion and a handful of officer cadets. There was no great battle, no epic clash of armies. The October Revolution, as it would come to be known, was almost anticlimactic in its execution. The palace guards melted away. Some of the women's battalion were assaulted by Red Guards and fled. In the evening, the Aurora fired a blank shot, a signal that echoed across the city. Red Guards and revolutionary sailors entered the palace through unlocked doors and unguarded entrances, wandering through the vast halls, searching for the ministers. When they found them, in the early hours of the morning, the ministers were arrested without resistance. Kerensky had already fled, escaping in a car borrowed from the American embassy, still hoping to rally loyal troops to retake the capital. By morning, the Bolsheviks controlled Petrograd, and Lenin stood before the Congress of Soviets and declared that a new era had begun, that the old world was dead, and a new one was being born. He announced an immediate armistice with Germany, the redistribution of land to the peasants, the transfer of all power to the Soviets. But declaring a revolution and consolidating it are 2 very different things, and what followed would be a descent into violence that would consume Russia for years to come. The Bolsheviks faced opposition from every quarter. The other socialist parties denounced the seizure of power as a coup.
When elections for the Constituent Assembly were held in November, the Bolsheviks won only a quarter of the votes, with the Socialist Revolutionaries winning an absolute majority. Lenin allowed the assembly to meet once in January 1918 and then dissolved it at gunpoint, declaring that Soviet democracy was superior to parliamentary democracy, that the will of the working class as expressed through the Soviets trumped the votes of the peasant masses. The other parties walked out in protest, and some began to organize armed resistance.
The Civil War did not begin with a single declaration or a clear moment of rupture. It began as a series of small rebellions, local uprisings, acts of resistance that spread like wildfire across the vast expanse of Russia. In the south, in the lands of the Don Cossacks, a warrior people with a tradition of independence in military service, former Tsarist officers began to gather. Men who had fought in the Great War and had no intention of bowing to a government of workers and peasants. They called themselves the White Army, taking their name from the traditional color of royalism and legitimacy, in contrast to the Reds. They saw themselves as the defenders of traditional Russia, of order and hierarchy in the old ways, of Orthodox Christianity and the Russian nation. Their leaders were men like Anton Denikin and Pyotr Wrangel, professional soldiers who believed in discipline and chain of command, who looked at the Bolsheviks and saw only chaos and bloodshed. In Siberia, Admiral Alexander Kolchak declared himself supreme ruler of Russia, establishing a government in Omsk that claimed legitimacy as the true heir to the fallen empire. Kolchak was a career naval officer, a decorated hero of the Great War, a man who believed in autocracy and military discipline. He had the support of the Czech Legion, a force of 50,000 Czech and Slovak prisoners of war who had been fighting for the Russian army and who now controlled much of the Trans-Siberian Railway. The Trans-Siberian Railway became a lifeline, a ribbon of steel stretching across thousands of miles, carrying soldiers and supplies, refugees and prisoners, hope and desperation. Control of the railway meant control of Siberia, and the battles that raged along its length were crucial to the outcome of the war. Foreign powers watched Russia's collapse with a mixture of fear and opportunism. Britain, France, the United States, Japan all sent troops to Russian soil ostensibly to protect their interests, to prevent weapons from falling into German hands, to support the anti-Bolshevik forces. British troops landed in Archangel and Murmansk in the north. American and Japanese forces occupied Vladivostok in the east. French forces briefly held Odessa on the Black Sea. The intervention was half-hearted, poorly coordinated, driven more by fear of Bolshevism spreading than by any clear strategy for restoring order. The Western powers were exhausted from the Great War, their populations war-weary and unwilling to support another major military commitment. But their presence complicated the conflict, turning a civil war into something larger, more international, more ideologically charged. The Bolsheviks, now calling themselves the Communist Party, found themselves besieged on all sides. Lenin moved the capital from Petrograd to Moscow in March 1918, deeper into the Russian heartland, easier to defend, away from the vulnerable border with Germany. The Kremlin became the nerve center of the revolution, its ancient walls sheltering a government that was inventing itself day by day, making decisions that would shape the course of the 20th century. To survive, the Bolsheviks created the Red Army, and to lead it, they turned to Leon Trotsky, a man whose brilliance and energy were matched only by his ruthlessness. Trotsky was a gifted orator, a theorist of revolution, but he was also a military organizer of genius.
He traveled the front lines in an armored train, bringing supplies and discipline, rallying troops, executing deserters, transforming a ragtag collection of workers' militias into a fighting force.
Trotsky's methods were brutal. He reinstated the death penalty for desertion and cowardice, which the revolution had initially abolished. He recruited former Tsarist officers to serve as military specialists, holding their families hostage to ensure their loyalty. Political commissars were attached to every unit, watching the officers, ensuring ideological correctness, ready to shoot anyone who showed signs of wavering. The Red Army grew from nothing to 5 million men by the end of the war, conscripted from the working class and the peasantry, often poorly trained and poorly equipped, but infused with revolutionary fervor and the discipline that Trotsky imposed with an iron hand. The war that followed was not a war of clean battle lines and honorable combat. It was a war of atrocity and terror, of brother killing brother, of villages burned and populations displaced. In the countryside, peasants found themselves caught between the Reds and the Whites, forced to give up food to feed armies they did not support, watching as their sons were conscripted into causes they did not understand. The Whites claimed to represent order and traditional values, but their armies were often undisciplined, prone to looting and violence. The Reds claimed to represent the workers and peasants, but their requisition policies stripped the countryside bare, leaving nothing for the people who grew the food. Typhus and cholera swept through the land, killing more than the bullets ever could. The diseases thrived in the chaos, in the crowded refugee camps, in the filthy trenches, in the unsanitary hospitals, where wounded soldiers lay dying for lack of medicine. Starvation became a weapon, a tool of policy. The cities were placed under what the Bolsheviks called war communism, a brutal system of requisition and control that stripped away any pretense of economic freedom. Food was rationed, labor was compulsory, private trade was illegal. The state controlled everything, and the state was the Communist Party. Anyone suspected of opposing the revolution could be arrested, imprisoned, shot. The Cheka, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, became the most feared institution in Soviet Russia. Its chief was Felix Dzerzhinsky, a Polish revolutionary with a gaunt face and burning eyes, a man who believed that terror was a necessary tool of revolution, that the enemies of the working class must be eliminated without mercy or hesitation. In July 1918, in the basement of a house in Yekaterinburg, in the Ural Mountains, in the early hours of the morning, Tsar Nicholas and his family were executed by Bolshevik forces. They were woken in the middle of the night, told they were being moved for their safety. They were led down to the basement. The Tsar and Tsarina, their 4 daughters, their hemophiliac son Alexei, their doctor, their servants. They were lined up against a wall. The executioners entered the room. Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant of the house, read out a brief statement declaring that they had been condemned to death by the Ural Soviet. Then the shooting began. The room filled with smoke and screams. Some of the family had sewn diamonds into their clothes as a precaution, and the bullets ricocheted off the hidden jewels, requiring the executioners to finish the job with bayonets. The bodies were stripped, thrown onto a truck, driven out into the forest, and dumped in a shallow mine shaft. Acid and gasoline were poured over them to prevent identification.
Later, they were moved again, buried in a different location, hidden so thoroughly that they would not be found for 70 years.
The murder of the Romanovs sent a message to Russia and to the world. There would be no restoration, no return to the old order, no mercy for those who had ruled before. The past was being erased, violently and completely. For the whites, the execution was an atrocity that confirmed everything they believed about Bolshevik barbarism. For the Reds, it was a necessary act, eliminating a symbol that could be used to rally counter-revolutionary forces. Lenin almost certainly approved the decision, though the exact chain of command has never been fully clarified. What is clear is that the execution marked a point of no return, a moment when the Civil War became total, when the very possibility of reconciliation vanished. The whites fought with courage and sometimes with savagery, but they were divided among themselves, unable to coordinate their efforts, unable to articulate a vision for Russia beyond a vague restoration of order. They were monarchists and republicans, conservatives and liberals, united only in their opposition to Bolshevism. Some wanted to restore the monarchy, though they could not agree on who should be Tsar. Some wanted a military dictatorship. Some wanted parliamentary democracy. Their failure to present a coherent alternative to Bolshevism was one of the key reasons they lost the war. The Reds, whatever their faults, at least had a clear program, a vision of the future, a promise of a new world. Some white commanders were brutal in their treatment of Jews, unleashing pogroms that killed tens of thousands, atrocities that would stain their cause and drive many who might have been neutral into the arms of the Reds. In Ukraine in particular, the pogroms were horrific. Cossack units and nationalist militias attacked Jewish communities, looting, raping, killing. Entire towns were destroyed. The anti-Semitism was fueled by conspiracy theories that blamed Jews for the revolution, by traditional prejudices, by the chaos of war that gave license to the worst impulses of humanity. The Bolsheviks, for all their brutality, at least officially opposed anti-Semitism, and many Jews joined the Red Army or the Communist Party, seeing it as the lesser evil, as a force that would protect them from the murderous violence of the whites. In Ukraine, the situation was even more chaotic. Nationalists declared independence, establishing the Ukrainian People's Republic, only to find themselves fighting against Bolsheviks, against whites, against Polish forces, against anarchist armies, led by figures like Nestor Makhno, a peasant revolutionary who carved out a brief republic in the south based on principles of self-governance and communal ownership. Makhno was a charismatic leader, a brilliant cavalry commander, a man who embodied the anarchist dream of a society without government or bosses. His black flag flew over towns and villages, and his cavalry raided supply lines, fought pitched battles against all comers, Reds and whites alike. For a time, he allied with the Bolsheviks against the whites, but it was an alliance of convenience, and it would not last. The Bolsheviks had no intention of allowing an anarchist experiment to survive in their backyard, and once the whites were defeated, they turned on Makhno with the same ruthlessness they had shown to all their enemies. The Red Terror became official policy in September 1918, after an assassination attempt on Lenin left him wounded. He was speaking at a factory in Moscow when a socialist revolutionary named Fanny Kaplan shot him twice, one bullet passing through his neck, another lodging in his shoulder. Lenin survived, but the attack gave the Bolsheviks an excuse to unleash a wave of repression that had been building for months. Felix Dzerzhinsky, head of the Cheka, unleashed a campaign of mass arrests and executions.
Thousands were killed, their crimes often nothing more than their class background, their former occupations, their suspected sympathies. Former nobles, merchants, priests, intellectuals, anyone who represented the old order was suspect. The Cheka did not need trials or evidence. Suspicion was enough. In the prisons and cellars of Russian cities, people disappeared, their fates unknown to their families, their bodies dumped in mass graves or thrown into rivers. The revolution was eating its own, consuming anyone who might pose a threat, real or imagined. The Red Terror was not random violence, it was systematic, bureaucratic, a tool of state policy. The Cheka kept records, filled out forms, wrote reports. Each execution was documented, each arrest justified in the language of revolutionary necessity. Dzerzhinsky believed that terror had to be organized, that it had to be cold and calculated rather than hot and emotional, that the enemies of the revolution had to be eliminated as efficiently as a surgeon removes a tumor. He was completely devoted to the cause, working himself to exhaustion, living in a small room with only a cot and a desk, driven by a fanatical belief that he was building a better world. By 1919, the Civil War had reached its most desperate phase. The Whites launched major offensives from the south and from Siberia, advancing toward Moscow, threatening to crush the Bolshevik government between two armies. Denikin's forces pushed north from the Caucasus, capturing city after city, and for a moment it seemed possible that the Reds might be defeated, that Russia might be pulled back from the edge of communist rule. Denikin's army came within 200 miles of Moscow. Kolchak's forces in Siberia advanced westward along the Trans-Siberian Railway, threatening to link up with other White armies. If the two forces had coordinated their offensives, if they had attacked simultaneously, they might have overwhelmed the Reds. But communication was poor, coordination was impossible across the vast distances, and the Whites were fighting separate wars, each general pursuing his own strategy with little regard for the others.
But the Red Army held. Trotsky's organizational genius, the sheer determination of the Bolshevik forces, the fact that the Reds controlled the industrial heartland and the railway networks, all of these factors turned the tide. The Reds had interior lines of communication, meaning they could move troops and supplies more easily than the Whites, who were scattered around the periphery of the country. The Reds controlled Moscow and Petrograd, the centers of Russian industry, where weapons and ammunition could be produced. The Whites depended on foreign supplies, which were erratic and insufficient. The White offensives stalled, then collapsed. Soldiers deserted, supply lines broke down, and the Reds counterattacked, pushing the Whites back, retaking territory, executing prisoners, showing no quarter. The Red Army's success was built on more than just logistics and organization. It was also built on ideology, on the belief that they were fighting for a just cause, for the liberation of the working class, for a world without exploitation. Political commissars worked tirelessly to instill this belief, holding meetings, giving speeches, distributing propaganda. The soldiers were taught that they were the vanguard of world revolution, that their struggle was part of a global movement to overthrow capitalism. This sense of historical mission sustained them through the terrible hardships of the war, through the cold and hunger and disease, through the waves of attacks that seemed to come from every direction. In Siberia, Kolchak's government disintegrated. His armies retreated along the Trans-Siberian Railway, a desperate exodus across the frozen wastes pursued by Red forces. The retreat became a nightmare of suffering. Soldiers and civilians alike fled eastward, jamming onto trains that moved at a crawl, freezing in the open cars, dying of typhus and starvation. The Czech Legion, disillusioned and exhausted, turned on Kolchak. They had been promised safe passage home if they helped fight the Bolsheviks, but the war seemed endless, and they wanted only to leave Russia. In January 1920, they handed Kolchak over to the Reds in exchange for safe passage. Kolchak was taken to Irkutsk, given a perfunctory trial, and executed by firing squad in February 1920, shot and his body pushed through a hole in the ice of the Angara River. His death marked the effective end of the White Cause in Siberia. In the south, Denikin resigned his command, handing it over to Wrangel, who made a last stand in Crimea. Wrangel was more capable than most of the white commanders, a brilliant tactician who understood that the whites needed to offer the peasants something more than vague promises about order and stability. He instituted land reforms in the territory he controlled, trying to win over the rural population, but it was too little, too late. The Bolsheviks had already promised land to the peasants, and even if they had not delivered on that promise, the peasants feared that a white victory would mean the return of the landlords, the restoration of the old system of exploitation and servitude. For months, Wrangel held out, creating a functioning government, training his army, trying to rally support. But by November 1920, the Red Army broke through, and Wrangel evacuated his remaining forces by sea, sailing into exile aboard a motley fleet of ships, leaving behind a Russia that was broken, exhausted, transformed beyond recognition. The evacuation from Crimea was one of the great tragedies of the Civil War. Over 100,000 soldiers and civilians, perhaps as many as 150,000, crowded onto ships in the ports of Sevastopol and Yalta, desperate to escape before the Red Army arrived. They sailed to Constantinople, to the Greek islands, to anywhere that would take them. They became refugees, stateless persons, scattered across Europe and beyond, never to return to the homeland they had fought to save. Their descendants would carry the memory of that defeat, that loss, that moment when the old Russia died and a new one, alien and hostile, took its place. The foreign interventions had achieved nothing. The British, French, and American troops withdrew, unwilling to commit to a long war in a distant land, unable to justify the costs to their own war-weary populations. The intervention had been a half measure from the start, too weak to decisively influence the outcome, but strong enough to allow the Bolsheviks to portray themselves as defenders of Russia against foreign invaders. The Japanese lingered longer in the Far East, occupying parts of Siberia until 1922, but eventually pulled back as well, having gained nothing but a few territorial concessions that they would lose again in the aftermath of World War II. The Bolsheviks had survived, not because they were loved, but because they were organized, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to hold power. They had outfought, outmaneuvered, and outlasted their enemies. They had maintained control of the industrial heartland, the railways, the major cities, while the whites were scattered on the periphery, unable to coordinate, unable to present a unified front, unable to offer a compelling alternative vision for Russia's future. The cost of victory was almost unimaginable. The Civil War killed millions, the exact number unknowable, lost in the chaos. Estimates range from 7 to 12 million deaths, perhaps more. Combat deaths, executions, disease, famine, all blurred together into a tableau of suffering that scarred a generation. Entire regions were depopulated. Infrastructure was destroyed. The economy had collapsed. Industrial production had fallen to a fraction of what it had been in 1913, perhaps 20% of what it had been in 1913. Agricultural output had plummeted.
People in the cities were starving, surviving on rations that were barely enough to sustain life, sometimes as little as 200 grams of bread per day. In the countryside, peasants hid their grain rather than hand it over to requisition squads, and when the government sent armed detachments to seize it by force, violence erupted, bitter and personal. In March 1921, sailors at the Kronstadt naval base, men who had been among the most ardent supporters of the revolution in 1917, rose in revolt, demanding free elections, freedom of speech, an end to Bolshevik dictatorship. The Kronstadt sailors had been the shock troops of the October Revolution, the ones who had stormed the Winter Palace, the ones who had defended the Bolsheviks in the desperate days of the Civil War. But they had grown disillusioned with the direction the revolution had taken, with the bureaucracy and the privileges of the party elite, with the suppression of all dissent, with the transformation of the Soviets into rubber stamps for party decisions. They issued a manifesto calling for a third revolution, a revolution against the Bolsheviks themselves, to reclaim the ideals of 1917.
Trotsky led the assault on Kronstadt, sending Red Army troops across the ice of the frozen Gulf of Finland, attacking the fortress in a series of bloody assaults that left thousands dead. The sailors fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. After 10 days of fighting, the Red Army broke through, taking the fortress in a final assault on March 18th. The survivors were shot or sent to labor camps. Some managed to escape across the ice to Finland. The suppression of Kronstadt was one of the most controversial acts of the Bolshevik government, a moment when they turned their guns on their own most loyal supporters. It showed that the party would tolerate no dissent, no challenge to its monopoly on power, even from workers and soldiers who claimed to be fighting for the true ideals of the revolution. Lenin, facing the reality that his government was on the brink of collapse, made a strategic retreat. In March 1921, at the 10th Party Congress, he announced the New Economic Policy, or NEP, a partial return to market economics, allowing peasants to sell surplus grain after paying a tax, permitting small private businesses to operate, allowing some degree of private trade. It was a pragmatic move, a recognition that war communism had failed, that the revolution could not survive on ideology alone, that the economy needed breathing room if the country was to recover. The NEP stabilized the economy, and over the next few years, Russia began to heal. Production began to rise, the cities began to fill again, the famine began to recede. But the NEP also created tensions within the party, debates about the future direction of the revolution, about whether socialism was being betrayed or merely postponed. Some Bolsheviks saw the NEP as a necessary tactical retreat. Others saw it as a dangerous compromise with capitalism, a betrayal of the workers in favor of the peasants, a step backward from the goal of a fully socialized economy. These debates would continue throughout the 1920s, and they would shape the struggle for power that followed Lenin's death. The Bolsheviks had won, but the country they ruled was a wasteland. Cities were half empty, their populations fled to the countryside in search of food. Factories stood idle, their machinery rusting, their workers scattered. The intelligentsia, the artists and writers and thinkers who had once made Russian culture shine, were dead, in exile or silent, forced to produce propaganda or face persecution. The old social structures had been obliterated, the nobility destroyed, the merchant class eliminated, the church persecuted. But the new structures were being built on foundations of violence and fear. The Cheka, renamed the GPU and later the NKVD, became a permanent fixture of Soviet life, a secret police force that watched, listened, arrested, and killed, ensuring that opposition to the party was impossible.
Lenin himself was fading. The wounds from the assassination attempt had never fully healed, and the strain of the civil war, the constant work, the stress of leading a revolution through its darkest hours had taken their toll. In May 1922, he suffered the first of a series of strokes that would leave him increasingly incapacitated. He lost the ability to speak clearly, then lost the ability to move his right side. He watched, helpless and frustrated, as his comrades began to maneuver for position, as Stalin, the crude but effective bureaucrat from Georgia, began to accumulate power as general secretary of the party. Stalin was not one of the brilliant theorists like Lenin or Trotsky. He was not a charismatic speaker or a military genius, but he understood the importance of organizational control, of appointing loyal followers to key positions, of building a network of patronage and obligation. While Trotsky and the other leaders debated theory and policy, Stalin quietly built a base of power within the party apparatus. In December 1922, confined to his dacha outside Moscow, Lenin dictated a series of notes that would become known as his testament. In them he assessed the leading members of the party, their strengths and weaknesses, and he warned against Stalin. Comrade Stalin, having become General Secretary, has concentrated enormous power in his hands, and I am not sure that he always knows how to use that power with sufficient caution. A few days later, Lenin added a postscript. Stalin is too rude, and this fault, entirely supportable in relations among us communists, becomes insupportable in the position of General Secretary. Therefore, I propose to the comrades to find a way to remove Stalin from that position and appoint to it another man. But it was too late. Lenin's health continued to deteriorate. He suffered more strokes. By 1923, he was effectively paralyzed, unable to speak, cut off from the political life of the party he had created. Lenin died on January 21, 1924, at the age of 53. His body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum in Red Square, where it remains to this day, a preserved relic of the revolution. His death set off a power struggle within the party, a struggle that Stalin would eventually win, sidelining Trotsky and the other old Bolsheviks, consolidating his control, transforming the Soviet Union into a totalitarian state unlike anything the world had seen before. The Civil War had forged the Soviet Union in blood and iron. It had taken a revolutionary moment and hardened it into a dictatorship, had transformed a party of revolutionaries into a ruling class, had replaced one form of tyranny by another, newer and perhaps more total. The experience of the Civil War shaped everything that followed. The siege mentality, the belief that the revolution was constantly under threat from enemies within and without, became a permanent feature of Soviet political culture. The willingness to use terror as an instrument of policy, the conviction that the ends justified any means, the subordination of individual rights to the supposed needs of the collective, all of these were forged in the crucible of civil war and would define the Soviet system for the next 70 decades.
The Whites had lost, not because they lacked courage or commitment, not because their soldiers were cowards or their generals incompetent, but because they had no unifying vision, no message that could compete with the Bolshevik promise of land and bread and peace, however hollow that promise proved to be. They represented the past, and in a time of revolutionary upheaval, the past had no purchase, no ability to inspire the masses to fight and die. They offered order, but order without justice, stability without transformation, a return to a world that had already failed, that had sent millions to die in the trenches of the Great War, that had kept the peasants in servitude and the workers in poverty. The Bolsheviks, whatever their crimes, at least offered hope, offered the possibility of something new, something different, a world where the exploited would become the rulers and the rulers would be cast down.
The peasants had fought and died not for communism, but for survival, and in the end they were the greatest losers of all. During the Civil War they had seized the land, divided up the estates, fulfilled the ancient dream of owning their own plot of earth. But in the years that followed, that dream would be taken from them. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Stalin would launch the collectivization campaign, forcing the peasants onto collective farms, seizing their land, their livestock, their grain. Those who resisted, the kulaks, the supposedly wealthy peasants, would be deported to Siberia or executed. Millions would die in the famines that followed, particularly in Ukraine, where the Holodomor, the Great Hunger of 1932 and 1933, would kill between 3 and 7 million people, a man-made catastrophe inflicted by deliberate policy. The peasants' autonomy was destroyed, their lives reduced to service to the state, their existence reduced to fulfilling production quotas set by distant bureaucrats who knew nothing of farming and cared nothing for the people who worked the land. The workers, in whose name the revolution had been made, found themselves bound to their factories, forbidden to change jobs without permission, subject to harsh discipline and inadequate pay. The Soviets, the workers' councils that had been the organs of revolutionary power in 1917, became hollow shells, mechanisms for transmitting party directives rather than expressing the will of the working class. Trade unions were absorbed into the state apparatus. Their function changed from defending workers' interests to enforcing labor discipline. The dictatorship of the proletariat became a dictatorship over the proletariat, and the workers who had made the revolution found themselves with less freedom than they had enjoyed under the Tsar. The foreign powers had intervened and failed, and their failure left a legacy of mistrust, a belief among the Bolsheviks that the capitalist world would always be their enemy, would always seek to destroy them. This belief shaped Soviet foreign policy for decades to come, driving the arms race, the espionage wars, the ideological competition of the Cold War. Stalin would use the threat of foreign intervention to justify his purges, to claim that spies and saboteurs were everywhere, that vigilance was necessary, that anyone could be an enemy agent. The memory of the Civil War, of fighting for survival against overwhelming odds, became a tool of domestic repression, a way to justify any crime in the name of defending the revolution. The experience of civil war, of fighting for survival against overwhelming odds, created a siege mentality within the party, a conviction that ruthlessness was not a choice but a necessity, that mercy was weakness, that the revolution must be defended at any cost. This mentality permeated everything, shaped every policy, justified every atrocity. When Stalin launched the Great Purges in the 1930s, when he ordered the execution of hundreds of thousands of party members, military officers, intellectuals, ordinary citizens, he was drawing on the logic of the Civil War, the logic that said that potential enemies must be eliminated before they could act, that suspicion was enough, that better to kill 100 innocents than let one guilty person escape. The Civil War also established the pattern of using mass violence as a tool of social engineering. The Bolsheviks had discovered that entire classes of people could be eliminated, that traditional social structures could be destroyed through systematic terror, that a new society could be built on the ruins of the old. This lesson would be applied again and again, in the decollectization campaigns, in the collectivization drive, in the ethnic deportations of World War II, when entire peoples, Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, were loaded onto cattle cars and shipped to Central Asia, accused of collective treason, punished for the alleged crimes of a few. The intellectuals, the writers and artists and thinkers who might have provided a critical voice, a check on power, were silenced or co-opted. Some fled into exile during the Civil War, joining the millions of Russian émigrés scattered across Europe, creating a diaspora that would preserve the memory of the Russia that was lost. Those who remained had to choose, collaborate with the regime, producing socialist realist art and literature that glorified the party and its leaders, or face persecution. Some, like the poet Osip Mandelstam, chose resistance and paid their lives. Mandelstam wrote a poem mocking Stalin, calling him a murderer, and for this crime he was arrested, sent to a labor camp, and died there in 1938,
his body thrown into a mass grave. Others, like Boris Pasternak and Anna Akhmatova, survived by writing for themselves, hiding their best work, publishing only what was acceptable, living in a kind of internal exile. The church, which had been one of the pillars of the old Russia, was systematically persecuted. Priests were arrested, churches were closed or converted into warehouses and museums of atheism. The Bolsheviks saw religion as the opiate of the masses, a tool of oppression that kept people docile and accepting of their exploitation. They believed that the new Soviet man would have no need for God, that science and reason would replace superstition and faith. Thousands of clergy were executed during the Civil War in the years that followed. Monasteries were dissolved. Religious education was forbidden. By the 1930s, the Orthodox Church in Russia had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, barely tolerated, kept alive only because Stalin found it useful during World War II as a tool for mobilizing patriotic sentiment. The nationalities of the former Russian Empire found that the Bolshevik promise of self-determination was a lie. In theory, the Soviet Union was a federation of equal republics, each with the right to secede. In practice, it was a centralized dictatorship, dominated by Russia and ruled from Moscow. The non-Russian peoples, the Ukrainians, Belarus, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Central Asians, all found themselves subject to Russification, to policies designed to suppress their languages and cultures, to subordinate their identities to the larger Soviet project. During the Civil War, the Bolsheviks had promised autonomy to win support. After the war, that autonomy was gradually stripped away, replaced by Russian dominance and party control.
In the years that followed, the Soviet Union would industrialize at a breakneck pace, transforming itself from a backward agricultural country into an industrial powerhouse. The 5-year plans launched by Stalin in 1928 mobilized the entire country for rapid industrialization, building massive factories, dams, power plants, steel mills. The human cost was immense. Workers labored under brutal conditions, living in barracks, surviving on inadequate rations, driven by quotas and propaganda. The Gulag, the system of labor camps, expanded to hold millions, providing slave labor for construction projects in the most remote and inhospitable regions of the country. Prisoners built railways, mined gold, felled timber, died by the thousands from cold, hunger, exhaustion, disease. The industrialization was real, the achievements genuine. By 1940, the Soviet Union was a major industrial power, capable of producing tanks, aircraft, weapons in vast quantities. This industrial capacity would be crucial in World War II, when the Soviet Union would face the Nazi invasion and, at enormous cost, turn back the German armies and march to Berlin. But the achievement came at a price that is difficult to comprehend. Millions died in the famines of collectivization. Millions more died in the Gulag. The Great Terror of 1936 to 1938 killed perhaps 1 million people, the exact number unknown, lost in the archives, in the mass graves, in the secrecy that surrounded the operations of the NKVD. The show trials of the 1930s completed the destruction of the old Bolshevik leadership. One by one, the heroes of the revolution were arrested, tortured, forced to confess to absurd crimes, to admit that they had been spies, saboteurs, traitors from the beginning. Zinoviev and Kamenev, old comrades of Lenin, were shot. Bukharin, the party's leading theorist, were shot. Tukhachevsky and most of the Red Army's senior officers were shot, leaving the military decapitated on the eve of World War II. Trotsky, exiled in 1929, was assassinated in Mexico in 1940 and ice axe driven into his skull by an NKVD agent. Stalin eliminated everyone who would go part of the revolutionary generation, everyone who remembered how things had been, everyone who might challenge his version of history. The Civil War's legacy was thus a paradox. It had saved the revolution, had allowed the Bolsheviks to survive and consolidate power.
But it had also brutalized the revolution, had turned it into something monstrous, had created a system based on terror and lies, a system that devoured its own children and called it progress. The idealistic young revolutionaries who had stormed the Winter Palace in 1917, who had believed they were building a new world of freedom and equality, would have been horrified by what their revolution became. Most of them did not live to see it, having died in the Civil War or the purges that followed.
The question that haunts the history of the Russian Civil War is whether it had to be this way, whether the violence and terror were inevitable consequences of revolution, or whether different choices might have led to different outcomes. Could the Bolsheviks have shared power with the other socialist parties, creating a genuine multi-party democracy? Could they have been less ruthless, less willing to use terror as an instrument of policy? Could they have respected the rights of the peasants, allowed some degree of economic freedom, avoided the catastrophe of forced collectivization? These are counterfactual questions, impossible to answer with certainty, but they point to moments of choice, moments when different decisions might have been made. Some historians argue that the logic of Leninist ideology made terror inevitable, that the very concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, of the vanguard party that would lead the masses to socialism, contained within it the seeds of totalitarianism. Others argue that the circumstances of the Civil War, the desperate fight for survival, the brutality of the enemy, the foreign intervention, all pushed the Bolsheviks toward extremism, that different circumstances might have produced a different outcome. Still others point to individuals, particularly Stalin, arguing that his personal cruelty and paranoia shaped the system, that under different leadership, the Soviet Union might have evolved in a less murderous direction. What is clear is that the Civil War was a turning point, a moment when choices were made that shaped the course of the 20th century. The victory of the Bolsheviks meant that a sixth of the Earth's surface would be governed by a communist dictatorship, that millions would live under a system that promised liberation but delivered oppression, that the world would be divided into rival camps, capitalist and communist, locked in a struggle that would bring humanity to the brink of nuclear annihilation. The Russian Civil War also inspired revolutionaries around the world, offering a model of how a small, disciplined party could seize power and hold it against all odds. Communist parties were founded across Europe, Asia, Latin America, Africa, all looking to Moscow for guidance and support. The Intercomintern, the Communist International, was established to coordinate the world revolution, to spread Bolshevik ideology and methods to every corner of the globe. Some of these movements would succeed, establishing communist regimes in China, Vietnam, Cuba, and elsewhere. Others would fail, crushed by repression, defeated by rivals, unable to replicate the specific conditions that had allowed the Bolsheviks to triumph in Russia. The human cost of these revolutions was enormous. The Chinese Civil War killed millions. The Cambodian Revolution under the Khmer Rouge killed a quarter of the country's population. The pattern established in Russia of using mass violence to transform society, of eliminating entire classes of people, of subordinating individual rights to collective goals, was replicated again and again, with results that were uniformly catastrophic. The 20th century became the age of ideological mass murder, and the Russian Civil War was where it began.
By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, 74 years after the October Revolution, the dream of communism had been thoroughly discredited. The planned economy had failed, unable to compete with market capitalism, producing shortages and inefficiency rather than prosperity. The political system had failed, unable to reform itself, unable to provide freedom or democracy, unable to win the loyalty of its own citizens. When the end came, it came quickly and almost bloodlessly,
The Communist Party dissolving, the Soviet Union breaking apart into 15 independent republics, the red flag coming down from the Kremlin for the last time. The legacy of the Civil War and the revolution it secured is contested and painful. In Russia today, opinion is divided. Some see the Soviet period as a time of great achievements, of industrialization and victory in World War II, of Russia as a superpower respected and feared around the world. Others see it as a time of horror, of mass murder and oppression, of crimes against humanity that have never been fully acknowledged or atoned for. The debate continues, shaped by politics and memory, by the need to make sense of a past that was both heroic and monstrous, both liberating and enslaving. What cannot be disputed is that the Russian Civil War was one of the defining events of the 20th century, a moment when the old world died and a new one was born in violence and blood. The Bolsheviks rose to power in the chaos of revolution and war, and they held that power through ruthlessness and terror, through organization and ideology, through a willingness to do whatever was necessary to survive. They won, and in winning, they changed the world, setting in motion forces that would shape the lives of billions of people, that would create new nations and destroy old ones, that would inspire revolutions and provoke counter-revolutions, that would divide humanity and bring it to the edge of extinction. The story of the Russian Civil War is ultimately a story about the price of revolution, about what is lost when societies try to remake themselves through violence, about the gap between utopian dreams and brutal realities. It is a story that reminds us that good intentions are not enough, that revolutionary fervor can be perverted into tyranny, that the promise of freedom can become the reality of oppression. It is a story that asks us to confront uncomfortable questions about power and violence, about ends and means, about the limits of what can be achieved through force and the costs of trying. The men and women who lived through the Russian Civil War, who fought in its battles, who suffered in its famines, who died in its prisons, deserve to be remembered not as abstractions, not as statistics, but as human beings caught up in events larger than themselves, trying to survive, trying to make sense of chaos, trying to build something better even as the world collapsed around them. Their stories are stories of courage and cruelty, of hope and despair, of sacrifice and betrayal. They lived in one of the most terrible periods in human history, and their choices, their struggles, their suffering shaped the world we inherited. The Russian Civil War ended in 1922, but its consequences echo down the decades. The Soviet Union it created would endure for 70 years, would fight and win the Second World War, would compete with the United States for global dominance, would collapse in 1991, leaving behind a legacy that is still being debated and contested. The Bolsheviks rose, and in rising, they showed the world what revolution could achieve and what it could destroy. They showed that small groups of determined people could seize power and reshape societies, but also that the costs of such transformations could be catastrophic, that the promised land of socialism could become a nightmare of oppression and suffering. And so the story of the Russian Civil War remains relevant, a warning and a lesson, a reminder of what happens when certainty becomes fanaticism, when idealism curdles into cruelty, when the dream of a better world justifies any crime, any atrocity, any amount of suffering. It is a story that should not be forgotten, because the choices it presents, the questions it raises, are eternal. How do we balance order and justice? How do we achieve change without destroying everything? How do we build a better world without becoming monsters ourselves?
The Russian Civil War offers no easy answers, only the harsh lessons of history, written in blood across the vast expanse of Russia. Lessons that humanity continues to grapple with more than a century later.